I followed it into the woods. Saying that aloud still tastes like cold metal in my mouth. I'm recording this because I need a place to put the facts where they won't be eaten by rumor or by whatever people tell themselves to sleep at night. Names and angles will come later. For now, it's just me and the memory of heavy footprints leading away from my porch, the weight of snow compressing around them like an accusation. I want you to picture the moment before I went after it. A gust of wind that sounded almost like a voice, a porch light sputtering, and the thing on my threshold that made me do something I still can't fully explain. If you like slow burn encounters with a twist, subscribe. There's more like this. The first time I saw it, it was an outline against the storm. I had been living alone for 3 years in a cabin 15 miles off the Ridge Road, since Linda left and the house sold and the city shrank to a distant, inconvenient rumor. I learned to like silence the way others learn to drink bad coffee, out of habit. The cabin was my skin, drafty in places, warmed by a stubborn wood stove, cluttered with a lifetime of unpaid attention. On that night, February leaning toward March, the storm came in sheets. The road was gone by 9. The radio lost signal 2 hours later. I had just thrown another log on the stove when something large pressed itself against the porch glass. At first I thought deer, a stupid, vernacular assumption. Then it turned its head, and the light caught 2 eyes. Not the white shine of a deer, not predatory like a coyote. They were deep and slow and amber, like old light trapped behind glass. The thing hunched there, taller than the threshold, all matted fur and wet clumps. Breath fogged the glass in big, deliberate puffs. It had a hand, wide, knuckled, with nails like worn tools, pressed on the frame, scanning like a person who couldn't yet read the world. I have a rifle in the corner by the stove. I also have a heart that remembers small kindnesses. That night the kindness won. I put on a coat, opened the door, and for a foolish second I believed I was doing what any decent man would, offering warmth to a wounded animal. It stepped inside without a sound and closed my life's light like a coin. It was enormous up close, the height of a tall man, but broader, as if its shoulders carried an old storm. The first smell hit me. Wet fur, the earth after rain, something underneath that was not quite animal and not quite human. It didn't growl. It didn't snap. It lowered its head toward the stove in a gesture that read as instinct and as gratitude. It stood there, shaking off snow, and I made tea like a man who had forgotten how to be surprised. Those first hours were the most innocent. I threw a blanket over its shoulders, because that's what my hands do when they meet cold. I set out the emergency rations, canned beans, crackers, the ridiculous stack of sugar-free cookies Linda used to hide in her dresser.
It accepted the tea with a mannered, clumsy caution, using long fingers to cup the mug as if afraid to burn the skin at the rim. It watched me cook with an intense, almost deferential silence. Every so often it would tilt its head toward the window and listen, as if the wind carried names. I told myself stories to make sense of it. Maybe it had been struck by a truck and crawled off the road. Maybe it was drawn by the scent of my fire. Maybe curiosity had a body and a face and found its way to me. I was a man who had once mended a broken wing on an owl. Compassion in my hands had a track record. I had a past of soft choices. That past made me open the door and keep it open. The second night, something changed. The creature slept sitting up, leaning against a wall, hands folded over knees like an old fisherman dozing at a pier. I lay awake and watched it watch the dark. It didn't snore. It breathed in long, regular pulls, but every hour or so it would blink its eyes and turn its head toward the woods, toward the only direction that wasn't the cabin. Once it put its hand against the glass where the porch light blew, and its palm left a smear like a child's drawing of the moon. I started noticing patterns. It learned the grooves in my day with a patience that felt studied. When I loaded the stove, it would bring in split oak from the porch and stack it in a different order than I would have. It arranged my firewood by size, then by the sound they made when struck together. It seemed to value the small, functional tidiness of the cabin the way someone might value a ritual. There were other signs. The way it watched my hands as I hammered a loose plank in the stair. It sat next to the workbench for an hour, fingering the hammer with slow curiosity. Not a clumsy pawing, but a deliberate handling, like a child discovering a lock for the first time. It mimicked, too, small things at first, drinking with both hands when I did, wiping its mouth after eating like I would. When I hummed, I caught it copying the rhythm on the windowsill, tapping out a cadence with fingers as if learning to speak. Mimicry is a dangerous thing in a house built by one person. You can forgive the imitation of manners. You cannot forgive the imitation of ownership. On the fourth day, I left my keys on the kitchen counter while I filled a pot at the sink. I turned, and the keys were gone. It had not pushed my chair over or broken the keys. It had removed them as carefully as one removes a splinter, placing them inside a matchbox and sliding the box beneath a stack of coasters. When I discovered them later, tucked away like an offering, I felt both foolish and violated. It was a small theft, but it spoke of attention. It told me it had been watching not merely the shape of my days, but their contents. I began to notice other things moved. A photograph leaned slightly downhill. A chair was nudged an inch closer to the stove. The radio was set to a station I never tuned into.
Its actions weren't malicious. They were experiments. It was learning how this environment reacted to insertion. When I asked it, in my small human voice, why, it tilted its head and patted my sleeve with the pattern of a question. There was a moment when I should have called someone. A rational man, a man with neighbors and an internet connection and a town with a sheriff, might have arranged for help. But I didn't. The storm had cut the road. The nearest neighbor was 1.5 miles and unsympathetic to nighttime events that smelled of myth. Besides, I was still holding on to the idea that I had done good. The creature's gratitude, the way it mimicked the word please with its hand in a motion that looked like asking, fed a part of me that had been starving. Days blurred. The storm kept the horizon a rumor, and the mornings arrived with the same measured frost on the window. I began leaving food out by the porch, not because I feared it would starve, but because there was a ritual to it, an acknowledgement that we existed under the same sky. It would come out at dusk and take what I placed, moving with such quiet intention that the snow barely remembered the imprint of its feet. At night, its stare turned more focused. It didn't sleep the way humans sleep. Instead, it watched the corners, listened to the house settle into itself. When I got up to pee, I would find it waiting in the doorway like an old friend, forehead resting against the frame, eyes reflecting in the hall light. The feeling of being watched was thick enough to sit on. Sometimes it would stand very still and mimic my posture, putting its hands in pockets, tilting its head when I did, as if rehearsing the person I had become. When you live alone, your gestures are your own. When another being begins to copy them, it's as if your history is being rehearsed by an actor. A slow, insidious terror crept in at that point. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It was the realization that the thing could learn, and that what it learned could be used. It could learn to open the pantry, to find where I hid cigarettes, to set a cup of tea beside my bed if it wanted. The knowledge that something is learning you is a different kind of violence. I tried tests of my own. I left a coin on the windowsill and watched it the next morning. Coin gone, window dust arranged in a small circular pattern. I hid the toolbox key and watched as it sat by the workbench and whistled in a low way. It didn't panic. It sat patient as a priest at confession, and then it pressed its palm flat to the wood, as if reading a memory. Later, when I checked the drawer, the key lay beneath a strip of cloth folded like a letter. Once it moved the layout of my kitchen. The bowls were the same, but their positions shuffled into a pattern I didn't recognize. It wasn't just rearrangement, it was communication. Someone who watches long enough learns the grammar of objects.
I began leaving notes in places I thought it would find, small phrases like, "Who are you?" And sometimes I'd come back to find them folded into my coat pocket. You should know it never spoke words, no voice. It grunted once, in a way that almost sounded like laughter, when I misstepped down the back stairs and landed on a cushion I had placed there. Its mouth, when it opened, exposed straight teeth that were more utilitarian than animal. It looked at me with an intelligence that was not human but not void. If you needed a comparison, imagine a child who had read 100 books but never been taught how to make a single crucial decision. There is a particular image I can't shake. One evening I caught it standing in front of the mirror hanging by the hallway, studying its own reflection with a patience that made me ashamed. It prodded the glass with a fingertip and drew a faint circle of condensation. For hours it traced the shape with the tip of its finger, then drew a line through the circle, like a person crossing out a name. It began to touch the frames on my wall.
Linda's face in the wedding photo, lighter than, hair braided, smiling at something that had nothing to do with me, drew its attention. It would stand for long moments looking at Linda's eyes, then at me, then back again. Once it lifted the frame very carefully and peered into the photograph as if expecting the person inside to step forward. It set the frame back and left a smudge only I would recognize, a thumbprint on the glass, small and sweaty. That night, sleep fled me. I sat by the stove and remembered the dinner table that no longer had 2 plates. Memory in the cabin is a visible thing. It bubbles up like steam from boiling water. The creature noticed the way I flinched at certain sounds and began to make those sounds deliberately, a mimicry not of me but of the absence I carried. It would tap the radio once at midnight, then again at 12:07. The 2 taps a sequence that made me think of the clock Linda and I used to own. Once you start recreating someone else's absences, the house begins to feel like a museum of wrong answers. I told myself I could walk away. I could lock it out. But there was a night when the storm eased for a breath, and the woods pressed something against the door. Footprints, smaller and feathered, converging toward my porch from the tree line. The creature stood at the threshold and lifted a hand, not to enter but to indicate the path away. It gestured with 2 fingers, then 3, as if counting people or signaling direction. It moved its head toward the trees, and then back to me. The meaning, if any, was not explicit, but the implication was, come and see. Curiosity pushed under my ribs like a finger. There was also guilt, a compound of empathy and fear. For whatever reason, it had chosen me. Choosing is a heavy thing. I had let it in. Perhaps it wanted me to go with it.
Perhaps the thing had learned the way loneliness can be answered by the presence of another and meant to replicate that answer on a wider scale. 2 weekends after it arrived, it began to use the tools on the workbench without my permission. I would find the hammer across the floor, the nails still warm in their spots. It wasn't destructive, not in the common sense. It built small things, little structures of twigs and wire found in my garage, a crude ladder, a box lashed with strips of cloth. Each item was placed outside in a ring on the porch, arranged with an intention that felt less about utility and more like invitation. When I caught it with the rifle, only once, through the cracked bedroom door, it was staring at the barrel with the kind of focus a watchmaker gives a fragile gear. It lifted a hand and traced the metal like someone reading Braille. It tapped the trigger guard gently, then withdrew as if the mechanism contained a truth not to be discovered quickly. The sight of it with a rifle almost broke something in me. I took the gun and put it away in the closet, where I had always kept it, the place Linda called messy and decided to ignore. I did not tell myself I was responsible for it. I told myself I was cautious. The thing watched me when I made coffee. It watched me when I shaved. It watched me until I felt observed down to the marrow. Sometimes, when the stove's flame painted the room in a sepia wash, it would sit in the doorway and clap its hands together softly, a repetitive sound that soothed me like a lullaby. There's a cruelty in lullabies when the singer is not yours. It might have been saying stay, or it might have been repeating a pattern of behavior that it had seen secure others' attention before. Either way, it worked. My roots, dry from years of solitude, found something to anchor to. On the 7th day, the first real test happened. I had a habit of leaving the back door unlocked at night because the latch had stuck and because the lock was a bother in the dark. The creature took to disturbing the latch, pushing at it in the way a child presses at a closed curtain. One night I woke to the sound of the door exhaling open. I came downstairs and found the back porch light out and deep footprints heading from the steps into the black. My hands were shaking before I realized they were holding a mug I hadn't sipped. I went out without a coat. The cold ate through me and made the world raw. There was a line of prints, wider than mine, heading toward the tree line. Smaller prints branched away from them in regular intervals, like marks on a ruler. The creature's prints stopped at the first stand of pines. It had written itself a ledger and left the last page for me to read. I could have run. I could have locked the door and called someone. Instead, I followed. Not far, just to the length of the yard, to the place where the snow held the outline of its shoulder and the pines leaned in as if to listen.
It had paused there and left a neat circle of stones arranged around what looked like crushed grass. In the center rested a photograph, face down. I almost didn't pick it up, afraid its revelation would crack everything I had cobbled together like cheap glass. But curiosity, like guilt, is hungry. The picture was of a road A straight line of tarmac stretching through birch trees, a photograph that carried summer light onto winter snow. On the back, scrawled in a hand that was not mine, were the initials LM. I folded the photograph into my mitten and went back inside, feeling a new sort of strangeness settle in my bones. It was as if the creature had found a way to place a question into my pocket. The next morning, it began bringing me things from the forest. Oddments, really. A broken compass, a child's mitten with initials sewn inside, a rusted watch that stopped at 3:14. One at a time, it laid them on the porch ledge like gifts or evidence. Each time I would pick them up and feel the story they carried. Some belonged to someone lost, some to someone who had simply walked away. The creature handled them with a reverence that made me think of prayer. That afternoon, it did something I had not yet seen. While I was outside stacking wood, I looked up and saw it standing by the edge of the tree line, looking back at the cabin as if measuring how much of me could be taken without tearing me. It raised one hand and counted on its fingers. 1, 2, 3, then pointed with an index finger toward the heart of the trees. Its other hand slapped the side of its chest twice, a rhythm I'd seen it use when asking for food. The sequence felt like an invitation and a test rolled into one. "You're not the only one out there, are you?" I asked aloud, stupidly, to the night. It blinked slowly, which I took as agreement. I told myself I would stay in the doorway and not go. I told myself that whatever existed beyond the ring of oak and pine was not for me. But there are times when explanations collect around your feet and trip you. That night, the prints on the porch were a ladder into the unknown, and inside me the kindling of shame and curiosity, and something that remembered Linda's voice saying once, that the world would go soft on me if I didn't reach out. So I did reach. I put on boots. I took the flashlight, though I knew its beam was a selfish effort against darkness. I pocketed the photograph with LM initials. I left my rifle behind, because the thought of bringing it into the woods felt like bringing a bar of soap into a grave. I told myself I was going to peer into the trees and come back. I told myself I wouldn't need to follow far. When it left the porch that night, it did not run. It moved like someone escorting a guest, a measured, deliberate progression with frequent halts to look back at me, to be sure I was still there. The first step it took made the snow hiss and sigh.
The footsteps it left were deep and confident, and smaller tracks scattered by them like a child's proofreading. The pines swallowed its shape almost immediately, and I felt a weight drop in the house, as if someone had taken the roof off my life. I paused at the line where the light failed. The forest beyond was not black, it was layered with blue and the faint underglow of ice. The creature turned, and for a moment our eyes met. In that look there was no menace and no plea, only the quiet assertion that things in the woods were arranged differently, and that I had a choice to make. I took a breath and stepped off the porch. The snow took my footprint and made it a part of itself. The air was thinner under the trees, and each inhalation tasted of sap and something older. I followed the prints into the scrim of trunks and the hush that lives only where people rarely tread. At first, the path was obvious, a single line of disturbed snow curving between the maples, leading toward a dip in the land where the moonlight did not reach. My flashlight painted the trunks in the way a metronome marks time. I kept my distance. The thing moved ahead as if escorting me to a lesson. Halfway to the dip, it stopped. It turned and made a gesture I had seen before, fingers counting, then tapping the ground twice. It pointed to the ring of stones I had seen that week, and then to the trees, and then, with a motion as small as a whisper, mimed closing a book. I should have gone back then. Instead, I tightened my scarf and moved closer. The wind changed. Something that had been background noise sharpened into a chorus, soft, synchronous exhalations that might have been breaths, or might have been the forest itself. The hairs on my arms rose as if someone had slid a hand along them. My flashlight caught movement at the edge of its beam. Nothing more than a suggestion, a silhouette that folded into the trunks like a piece of cloth settling on a chair. The thing ahead of me halted and turned. For the first time that night, I felt genuinely watched. The taps I had once called comfort now sounded like markers on a trail I did not understand. The thing looked into the dark and exhaled soft, small noises that could have been thought. Then it moved, not by walking, but by stepping with the care of someone crossing a frozen pond. The smaller prints that had accompanied its steps earlier now multiplied. I could have sworn I heard an answering click, far off, precise like pebbles dropped on grass. I stopped.
The cold reached inside me and found the place where courage used to sit. My hand went to the photograph in my pocket. LM. The initials felt like a key or a warning. I fumbled the photograph open, half expecting it to be blank. The image stared back at me, a road under a summer sun, and on the very edge, almost hidden, something like a dark figure crouched. Not detailed, just presence. I folded it back and shoved it deeper in my jacket.
When I looked up, the thing had gone silent. The other sounds, the soft breaths, the clicks, had ceased as if a conductor had dropped his baton. The air contracted, the trees leaned in, and the world held its breath. It was then I understood that following was not merely a physical act. It was a surrender, a decision to let someone draw you into their geography. The creature could have brought me to a clearing full of relics, or to a place where it kept others like it. It could have led me to a ritual that would have no mercy for my ignorance. It could have shown me wonders or horrors that would rearrange the furniture of my mind. I took another step. The light from my flashlight trembled on something ahead, a low mound of earth, or a shape covered in branches. The thing's silhouette froze beside it, and it placed a hand on my shoulder. The gesture was gentle, but it felt like pressure applied to the heart. It looked at me, and I thought for a moment that I could read its thought. Stay and understand, or turn and forget. I chose to stay. I stepped forward into the dip, and the world slipped away from the cabin like a shirt sliding off a chair. The trees closed around us, and whatever waited beyond that line of trunks became, at last, larger than the fear it inspired. There were sounds that night I don't have names for, something like a chorus, distant and precise, that threaded through the pines. An arrangement of objects, boots, mirrors, a child's toy, lay in a circle spaced carefully just beyond the reach of my flashlight. The air smelled of smoke, but not the kind I've tended in my stove. It smelled of torches and deep leaf rot, and whatever passes for incense in a place that has no church. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, and then stopped. The thing beside me moved and picked up an object from the circle with a reverence that made me think of hands that hold newborns. It handed it to me without looking. I realized with a cold clarity that I was in the middle of an exchange I did not understand. I took the object. It was a small, worn photograph with a corner eaten by water damage. The image was of a park bench and someone sitting on it, legs drawn close, a jacket thrown over shoulders. The back bore the same initials as the one in my pocket. I don't remember how I found my voice. My question faltered out the way speech does when it comes from a throat coated in frost. Who are they? The thing didn't answer. It pressed the photograph between my fingers, and then with a motion I will never forget, it tapped its chest twice and then pointed at me. The gesture was simple. I am lonely, it seemed to say. Or perhaps, I know loneliness and I brought you here because I thought you might know how to fix it. At that moment I felt the ground drop beneath me. The woods were not a wild, unthinking place. They were curated. The circle of objects, the photographs, the precise spacing, it all meant something.
It meant the creature had a history, not just with the land, but with people who'd passed through it. It meant it had been collecting fragments the way some people collect songs. Then something happened that pulled my breath out like a hand. From somewhere farther in the trees, a sound, low, coordinated, like an exhale synchronized across dozens of throats, rose and folded into the night. It was a sound that made my teeth ache. The thing at my side stiffened and looked into the dark with a kind of expectation that was neither friendly nor hostile. It tapped its fingers once on the handle of the small box it had carried and made a motion like counting. We listened. The sound came again, closer, and this time the silence that followed it was more oppressive than the sound itself. The flashlight caught nothing but tree trunks. My pulse hammered like someone calling from a well. I could feel the creature's muscles under its fur, waiting. At that point, I should have turned back. The rational avenues were all open to me: retreat, barricade, explanation. But the photograph in my pocket tightened its hold on my conscience. I had become the person who follows, not the one who flees. That is how the world teaches you to get into trouble. It gives you a reason that sounds noble. I stepped sideways into the shadow the creature had indicated. The trees swallowed the remaining light from the cabin behind me. Somewhere above, a wind scoured the branches like a broom. The hair on my neck lifted again. Whatever waited deeper in the woods had been summoned. It had a rhythm and a patience, and it was, at that moment, waiting to be seen. When the first shape moved at the edge of my flashlight beam, it was not alone. More shapes slipped out of the dark in a way that suggested choreography rather than chaos. They paused, not at the clearing, but at the line my light made. In an instant, the weight of the night gathered itself into presence. I took a step back and felt the cold of the air hit like a warning. The creature at my side touched my arm, a gentle pressure. It did not expect me to run. It expected me to watch.
The thing ahead, larger, or perhaps just closer in perspective, lifted one hand and pointed to the objects laid in the clearing. Its gesture was careful, almost ceremonious. I realized then that what we had been building toward was not a trap in the usual sense. It was a test, or an invitation, or both at once. It was something that would demand I relinquish a piece of myself and prove I could give it without breaking. I would find out what that demand meant. I would also find out the cost. I took a breath and moved forward again, because some decisions are not about courage so much as about the need to know what answers will do to you once they are spoken aloud. The night folded us in. My flashlight trembled in my hand. The creatures in the trees watched as if I were the one on trial.
When we reached the circle, the thing at my side removed a small, folded item from a pocket woven into its fur. It had my wife's handwriting on it once, I realized with a sharpness that hurt. A grocery list, perhaps, saved and carried away like scripture. The thing unfolded it and laid it gently on the ground at my feet, then tapped my chest and made the same 2 small motions it had made earlier. It seemed to be saying again and again, 2 beats on the sternum, the heart, the place where we answer. I couldn't tell if what I felt then was more fear or empathy. I bent and picked up the paper and felt the rough fibers cut into my palm. The world held its breath, and somewhere far in the wood, a sound rose like a question. I stepped backward, because some motions are responses to an old fear implanted before memory. My boot slipped on a root, and I barely kept balance. When I looked up, the faces in the dark had edged closer. Not faces like a human's, but planes of fur and eyes that reflected the dim light like stones. One of them, larger than the rest, stepped into the beam, and I saw its face clearly for the first time. There was something like a jawline, and a mouth that didn't smile, and eyes that were all knotted history. It inclined its head toward me, as if to say, either you will give, or you will be kept. I put my hand back into my jacket, and felt the photograph with LM's initials. My fingers closed around it like a small fist. The animal at the center of this ring watched me, and then looked past me toward the path home. It was then that I understood the real reason the creature had brought me out here, to see if I would follow. Not the act itself, but the willingness to go where it led. That willingness would be the test. Whether it would be mercy or punishment, whether whatever waited in the dark would let me return to my life unchanged, was what I could not see. I have never been a man of spectacle. I have been a man of small mercies and worse decisions. But when the thing at my side nudged me forward with a soft, deliberate pressure, I took another step and let the woods close around me. The rest of what happened, the sounds, the arrangement, the figure that raised a hand in a greeting or a warning, that is for later. For now, remember this. I followed it into the woods. My footprints are still there in the snow, if you know where to look. The house behind me has a gap in its warmth. There is a photograph in my pocket that smells faintly of smoke, and there is a pressure at my ribs like a hand tapping twice, waiting for an answer. The pressure at my ribs like a hand tapping twice stayed with me as we stood at the edge of that circle. For a moment the forest seemed to shrink to the sound of my own breathing, and the distant, precise chorus that had no business being so organized. The flashlight in my hand made the trunks look like pillars in some ruined cathedral. The thing beside me, the one that had learned my mornings and my cupboards and the exact pitch of my cough, rested a great careful palm on my shoulder and left me with a choice that felt older than the snow. I should tell you now about the moment I nearly broke. It's not chronological, not tidy. Memory refuses to be a single file when something presses into it. The hammer scene happened 2 nights before I followed them out. I had been alone in the shop, fingering a nail like it might be the last honest thing I owned, when I heard the slow creak of the closet where I kept the rifle. I turned and found the thing there, half in shadow, its face a pale shape in the lamplight. In its hands it held my claw hammer. It had learned the hammer well, the way it gripped the handle, the way it balanced the head on its palm. None of it was clumsy. It set the hammer down on the bench between us, as one might set down a Bible, then slid a long, careful finger along the metal where I had always kept a smear of oil. Then it turned that same hand toward me and tapped twice on its chest, the familiar 2 beats, and then mimed a striking motion with the hammer. It was offering me a script. The motion said, with a clarity that didn't need language, "You can use this to fix things, or you can use this to break." The thing had learned to read the language of my tools and of my habits, and it had learned, which was what made the offer the cruelest thing it could have done. It was not asking me to act, it was giving me the means to prove what kind of man I was. I remember the smell of the oil
and the way my hands went cold, the same cold that makes your fingers seem foreign. I did not take the hammer. I put my palms flat on the bench instead and tried to steady myself. The animal, the creature, tilted its head and watched me until the trembling stopped. Then it lifted the hammer and placed it back where it had been, like returning something borrowed. That scene is a small, sharp knot in the memory of those days. It is the moment I learned the particular kind of cruelty intelligence can possess. To hand you the tool that will show whether you will protect or destroy, and then to watch you answer. When I think about the woods later, I remember how that hammer looked in the dim light of the workbench, and how it tasted in my mouth like the metal of a verdict. I thought about it when I stepped off the porch, when the snow swallowed my boots, and the trees accepted me like a stranger at a wake. I thought about it when the circle of artifacts blinked into view, and the creatures in the dark fell silent as if reading my confession in real time. The circle was worse than I'd imagined. I had seen a scattering of objects from the porch before, a child's mitten, a rusted watch, a compass with its needle stuck forever pointing north. But in the clearing there was a density to it that bent my chest.
Hundreds of items, some ordinary, some intimate. A single shoe, a hairpin, a locket with no chain, a series of Polaroids yellowed at the edges. They were arranged with a patience that felt almost surgical. Pairs of shoes faced one another, a line of spoons curved like a spine, a child's stuffed animal propped upright, eyes turned toward the middle. The effect was not monstrous in the cheap sense. It was personal and precise, and that made it worse. Whoever had gathered them had been making a record. The creatures gathered at the line of trees around the clearing like parishioners. Their silhouettes moved in a way that suggested a practice, a set of gestures learned and repeated. They were not walking toward us as a pack might close in on a prey, nor as predators waiting to pounce. They were waiting for the ceremony to begin. My beam of light swept across faces, fur rubbed thin in places, eyes that held a reflected human light, hands that had done clever things. They watched me the way a judge watches a defendant who has just been led into court. One of them, larger than the others, its fur threaded with gray where youth had worn away, slid forward and laid a single object in the center of the ring. It resembled a ritual act I had no name for. The thing beside me nudged my hand, and I realized I was still holding an item from the porch, a photograph with LM written on the back. My fingers fussed with the corner without meaning to. The central object the larger creature had placed down was a locket that when opened held the picture of a woman laughing into sunlight. I smelled the faint perfume in the photograph, something like laundry left in a bag for too long. The creatures watched me to see what I would do. It was, I think, the first time in that night I understood that the test they had prepared was not about brute force or hunger. It was about whether I would become a donor, whether I would give something of myself to their collection, to their record, to the thing they were making of human absence. I thought of Linda, her handwriting on the edges of recipes tucked in a notebook, the way she used to laugh and tilt her head when she thought I was being silly. Her scent had not been on anything in the house for months, not since the last of her things went into boxes, but in the locket, the laugh was forever captured. The locket might have belonged to nobody I could name. The initials in my pocket were like a key that fit more than one lock. Still, in that ring of objects, my past seemed to have an echo. My hands trembled in a way I felt in my teeth. "Who are you?" I asked once more, my voice like an animal's whine. The words felt small in the bowl of trees. The thing at my side took the photograph I offered, not mine, the one with the park bench, the corner bitten by rain, and pressed it into the ground between us. It then took the locket and placed it gently within the photograph's frame, like nesting. The great creature at the center made a motion with both hands, 2 taps to the chest, then one open palm extended. The meaning was clear enough that a child's translation would have sufficed. We take, we show, we ask, we keep. The larger creature moved to the edge of the circle and picked something up with reverent precision. When it brought it into the center, I saw why the clearing had seemed like a museum. A photograph album, bound in faded leather and stained with rings of old coffee, lay on top of a small stump. The album was not mine.
When it opened it, the pages smelled like a hospital corridor, antiseptic and perfume, and I saw photographs I knew even before I recognized them. Street corners, faces caught between expressions, a dog running through a yard, the curve of a child's smile. There were names scribbled in the margins in a hand that was not mine. There were initials I could not place and handwriting I could not read. The creatures turned the pages with deliberate reverence. The larger one looked at me, then tapped the album once on the page and peered at my face. It put its mouth close to the binding and made a sound that had for months been part of the chorus. Low, vowel-like murmurs that might be speech if a language were being taught in slow, careful increments. It placed a finger on a photograph and then pointed at me. The album was a ledger of people. The creature's ritual was a catalog of those who had passed into their attention for whatever reason: loss, curiosity, walking alone in the wrong year, or perhaps something else. The implications folded in on me like a sudden storm. I did not scream. I could have. My throat felt too full. Instead, I sat down on a fallen log with a kind of animal composure, the way someone who knows they have surrendered to a tide will not panic until they understand the depth of the water. The creatures kept their distance. The larger one, I had no name for it, and giving it one felt foolish when there were so few words left, closed the album and set it on my lap. It then tapped twice on my chest with its knuckles, then slid a long finger under the album and drew out a single photograph with my name on the back. It handed the photograph to me with the careful attention someone shows to handing over a child's toy. When I unfolded it, my eyes went hot. It was a picture of me, not recent but not ancient either. I was standing by the stove in the cabin, a cup of coffee in hand, my hair pushed back the way it used to be before the winter of my quietness. Someone had taken the photograph in a way that suggested affection. I was laughing at something off frame. On the back, in a hand that trembled, was written Linda's name. I could have sworn I saw the ink smear where a tear had fallen. The large creature pointed at the photograph and then at the album and then finally at itself, making the 2 beats on its chest.
It tapped my knee in a motion that once, in the house, had been used to indicate sit. It wanted me to stay, in the same way the cold wanted me to move. The message was sharp as a knife. These things are not thefts of the body. They are collections of memory. They are how this other species kept track of us. They are how it curated its answer to the ache of being without. When I tell you that my terror then shifted into something describing a different feeling, pity perhaps, or rage at my own helplessness, it's not because fear left entirely. Fear lives in the body like a scar. It's always there under the skin. But what replaced the immediate animal panic was a deeper, knotted dismay. If these creatures had been taking pieces of humans for reasons I couldn't name, for affection or for a darker economy, then the moral map I had used to justify letting one into my house was horribly incomplete. "Did you take them?" I asked finally, because I had to know if this was a ledger or a collection of missing persons. The question was awkward because it assumed motive where perhaps none existed. The large creature lifted the album and pointed to a page, then made a motion with both hands like threading a needle. It closed the gesture with 2 taps on its own chest, and then summoned the smaller ones with a low whistle. One after another they brought objects to the ring: shoes, a child's hat, a pair of glasses with a cracked lens. Some objects were fresh, some old. All had been handled with the same care. The tallest of the smaller creatures stepped forward and placed a mirror at my feet. It pointed to the mirror, then to the album, then to me, and tapped the ground twice. The meaning came like a slow leak of water. They kept us for what we left behind. They kept us so they could remember faces. They kept them to respond to the ache of their own absence. It was then that I understood another terrible possibility. Perhaps some of those people had come into the woods willingly or unwillingly and had stayed. The album held smiles and streets and faces frozen in time. It did not answer whether the subjects had been taken or had walked into the clearing themselves. The creatures never once made a gesture that claimed violence in the way I was trained to see it. They made gestures of care. They made gestures of record. They made gestures that looked very much like a community trying to stitch itself to the lives of others. The larger creature then did something I did not expect. It reached into the album and drew out a photograph that at first glance I assumed belonged to someone else. It was a picture of a woman on a porch, braids tucked neatly, smiling at something past the camera. It took the photograph and put it gently on my palm. The woman's eyes were familiar in a way my memory could not account for. They held a tilt that meant the picture could have been from 1,000 possible summers.
There was a faint smudge on the edge of the photograph that matched the thumbprint I had seen on Linda's wedding frame at the cabin. My heart lurched because the resemblance was not coincidence. I had seen that same curve of smile in a dozen images tucked into my drawers. The creatures had an eye for detail. They collected faces that mirrored, in small ways, the people I had loved. If you want terror in the old-fashioned way, a scream in the night,
claws at your throat, blood raining like confetti. The ring of relics is not it. What terrifies is the moral ambiguity. What terrifies is the clarity of the question. What would you be willing to give to another being so it would stop scraping at the edges of its loneliness? What would you trade for the removal of that terrible pressure at the ribs? The creatures made that pressure explicit. They wanted something from me that I could not give until I understood its shape. The test reached for me in a practical way. The largest one stepped back and made a motion with its hands, slow as the chewing of a clock. It pointed to the objects arrayed in the circle, and then tapped twice on its own chest, and then extended an open palm toward me. The meaning was simple and terrible. Give. Give a thing. Leave something. Offer a piece to be kept in the ledger. I thought, in that tight-stomach, sick way, of the hammer, about the moment it had been returned to the bench, and the animal had watched me with equal parts expectation and curiosity. I thought of my rifle in the closet, and the way it had traced the metal like something reading scripture. I thought of the photograph with LM, the locket, the grocery list folded like a prayer. The things in my pockets felt suddenly heavy. I realized that to answer give with violence, to hand over a tool and become its executor, would be to submit to a morality I did not know. To answer with tenderness would mean surrendering possessions that were map lines to my life. I reached into my jacket and slowly pulled out the locket Linda had once worn. It was small and warm from the heat of my hand. The creatures watched the movement like a congregation receiving a sacrament. I held the locket up as if offering a toast. The larger creature inclined its head, but it did not accept. Instead, one of the smaller ones, the one that had first removed the keys and tucked them in the matchbox, padded forward and took an old grocery list out of its fur pouch. It unfolded it and pointed, word by word, at the things written there. Then it placed the list inside the locket and closed it, and set it in the center of the ring. It was not enough. I felt the breath leave me. The creatures had wanted an offering, but their ledger required a story, not a trinket. They wanted pieces of life threaded into each other. They wanted connection. The locket with a grocery list inside was a telling gesture, but it was not the answer to the question the clearing demanded.
The large creature turned and made a motion I had not seen before. It took my hand and led me to the edge of the ring, where a small, shallow pit lay. In it were charred stones arranged like teeth. The creature reached inside the pit and drew out a small object wrapped in a scrap of cloth. It handed the bundle to me with both hands, palms up. I unwrapped it with fingers that did not want to tremble. Inside was a small wooden token, carved with crude initials I did not know. There was a faint scent of smoke and rose. The creature tapped the token twice on its chest, and then pressed it into my palm as if placing a charge. It then made a motion that suggested the token was to be held against my sternum, where heart and decisions meet. The meaning washed over me in a way I could not have prepared for. They were requesting more than possessions. They were requesting presence. They were asking me to give them a thing that belonged to me, or to accept a thing that belonged to them as a pledge. They wanted me to become part of the ledger, to let my name be carried in the collection of objects, to be remembered in the same way they remembered others. They wanted a binding. It was the oldest social contract there is. You belong to us, and we will keep you. I felt a rage in me then that had nothing to do with violence. It was a human anger at being put in the position of person who must decide whether another's loneliness justified the cost. The thing beside me leaned close and tapped the album, then tapped me twice with the rhythm that had become their language. It was not an ultimatum, it was an offering. I can't lose her again, I said into the dark, and the admission felt like a betrayal and also a prayer. I thought of Linda's handwriting, of the thumbprint on the wedding frame, of the way the creature had looked at that photograph as if expecting the person to step forward. The arithmetic of grief is odd. You can calculate what you miss by number of objects, or by the density of light in a room. The creatures had chosen the former. One of them, the smaller one, the key thief, padded forward and took the token from my hand. It turned the token over, put it against its cheek, and then pressed it into a small hole in the stump at the center of the clearing. It tapped the stump twice, then reached back and took the album again. It opened the album to a blank page and put the photograph of me in it, tucking it gently like an offering. The gesture was simple and final. You are recorded. We will keep you. I felt like I had been cut open and placed into their ledger. The feeling was not purely exile. It was an inclusion of a strange kind. Horror did not feel like violence in that moment, but like a requirement that I accept a new definition of belonging. The creatures had brought me here to see if I would follow, and in following, to see if I would give something of myself to a system I could not understand.
Then, suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. a low sound rose from the trees, different than the chorus earlier, higher and threaded with a note that made the hair on my arms spike. The creatures all listened. The greater one stepped toward the edge of the clearing and made a slow, precise motion with its hands that resembled a counting. It looked past me to where the path slit through the pines and made a gesture that said, in a language of movement, "Go home." Then it pointed to the path and then back at the album, then tapped twice at its chest. There was an invitation in that motion. It meant that the test had been passed, perhaps not perfectly, perhaps not in any way I could have predicted, but passed. The ledger had accepted me as a story worth keeping. The creatures shifted back into the trees, receding like a tide, and the great one walked me to the path's edge as if escorting a guest. At the line of trunks it paused, set the album gently in my hands, and gave me a look that was not triumphant nor cruel, but deeply, incomprehensibly sad. Then it placed a single object in my palm, a small silver key on a frayed ribbon. The key was heavy with implication. It was not the key to my house. There was no tag. It felt like an answer or a question shaped by metal. The creature tapped twice on its chest and pointed to the path home. It was a blessing of its own lopsided kind. I walked back through the trees with my boots clumsy and my breath cutting short in the chilled air. The clearing slid behind me like a secret I had been permitted to know. When I reached the edge of the snow and saw the porch light of the cabin like a single yellow tooth, the warmth hit me and I felt both relief and a new, widening ache. I had followed it into the woods, I had been terrified in ways I had no name for, and I had returned with a ledger and a key and a photograph bound to me as proof that some species kept people like one might keep a radio tuned to a half-forgotten station. The days after were an odd blend of fear and a reluctant, careful tenderness. The creature resumed coming to the porch in the evenings, bringing small gifts and placing them with the same ritual precision as before. It never entered uninvited. It came to the threshold and tapped twice on the door with a polite, almost ceremonial rhythm. Sometimes it would leave a scrap of cloth folded just so, other times it would place a spiral of pine needles in a pattern on the step. I learned painfully to understand its pauses. When it pressed a mitten into my hand and tapped twice, I put my own hand over it and left it there like a promise. We negotiated a truce of barter and ritual. I left out food that was safe and sensible, canned goods, bread, an occasional can of corned beef because the creature seemed to like the salt. In return, it left things, an old watch whose hands no longer moved, a cassette tape etched with a voice I couldn't place. Once it left a child's drawing on the step.
It had used the box of crayons I kept for no good reason, on top of a grocery list folded twice. I covered it carefully and put it on the mantel. The creature's offerings were not always what I wanted. They were what they knew how to give. There were nights when the terror returned in small, sharp tendrils. Sometimes, 3 in the morning, I'd wake to find the back door open and a ring of tiny footprints on the porch where none had been before. Once I found the keys from my counter tucked neatly under the coasters again, as if the earlier theft had been a social courtesy rather than a challenge. When I thought I had been left alone, I'd find a photograph slid between the pages of my Bible, a small addition to the album the creatures had given me, and I'd feel the old pressure at my ribs, and then it would ease, like a hand released. Linda's face appeared in those photographs occasionally, sometimes more clearly than the others. Twice in the album's pages, there were pictures of a woman who might have been her, wearing her old cardigan and smiling down a road that landed in one of my own memories. I couldn't explain how the creatures had come by such images. They never presented them with malice. Instead, they set them before me with a reverence that felt like apology. One night, sitting by the stove, I opened the album and flipped through it until my fingers found a page where 2 photographs lay side by side. One was of a woman on a porch, the laces of her boots undone, the light catching her hair. The other was of my cabin, long before I had lived there, with curtains drawn and smoke from the chimney curling like an unused breath. Together they formed a kind of sentence. I realized then that the creatures had been tracking not only people, but places where people carried the quiet of themselves. They had a map of solitude. Talking to anyone about the ledger felt like sacrilege. Who would I tell? The sheriff would bring a flashlight and a clipboard, and if he was the kind of man I thought he was, a log of missing persons. The county would dispatch a search party. They would find the clearing and take what they thought was evidence and put a yellow tape around the trees. That was not what the ledger wanted. The ledger wanted us to be kept in the way dogs are kept on the porch, present, patrolled, a thing to return to. I chose silence because some kinds of truth cannot survive being fumbled into the light of practical men's hands.
Instead, I mended my life in small, treacherous ways. I started by making tea for myself without feeling like the house was an accusation. I cut my hair at the back where it had grown wild and left the clippings on the workbench like a sacrifice. I sent, one afternoon, a postcard to a neighbor who I had not spoken to since the divorce. It was a clumsy note, "Firewood to share, Alan," and it felt like opening a vein. He replied with a jar of pickles and a joke that made me laugh.
Laughter, I learned, was the other kind of small currency friends traded, and I had been poor for a long time. The creature kept visiting, always respectful of the threshold. It learned, gradually, the rituals of human courtesy, standing in the sodden light and waiting, never touching the radio unless invited. He draped over a small mound of fur outside where the creature had slept. It had not been a necessary gift. It had been a thing that said, in other terms, "I see you." There was one more test, if you want to call it that, and it happened when a man from town, a young fellow who mowed the few lawns in the area, came by to fix a generator. He had seen the footprints and asked if I'd had a party. I told him no, that winter made strange things of loneliness. He took another look at my porch and at the slight indentations where my boots had been, as if measuring something. He laughed at my story about the creature and went back to his truck. He left a can of paint on my step as payment for coffee and conversation. I painted the window trim 2 shades lighter than before, and the change made the cabin face the world differently. That night, after the man had left, I found outside my door a small collection of objects: the can of paint cap, a child's button, the cassette tape with the unknown voice. Each item was laid out with the same deliberation I had come to expect. The creature had arranged them into a new pattern, not a ledger this time, but an offering, a way of saying thank you for your neighbor's kindness, perhaps. It was an education in how to give back. Over weeks, the ledger grew. I added photos, small things Linda had left on the top shelf of a closet, a pair of earrings I had inherited from the way houses keep the ghost of a previous life. The creatures accepted them with a ceremony that was not language but intention. They left in return a small silver coin with an unfamiliar engraving and a scrap of cloth folded with care. The exchange felt like a pact neither of us had asked for explicitly. It made me feel less like an island and more like a buoy, tethered and necessary in a body of water. Evenings changed their shape. Where once the nights were long and ruled by the radio and my own dry voice, now they had a rhythm that sometimes included the soft, irregular tapping at the door. Sometimes I would open it and find the creature on the threshold, eyes amber and patient. I would make tea and place a cup on the stoop, and we would sit, 1 foot for each of us in 2 different worlds. It never spoke. It never needed to. Its hands, its offerings, the album of us served as a language. In time I learned to answer in kind: a jar of stewed fruit, a blanket folded on the railing, the locket with a grocery list tucked inside, as a kind of reciprocation.
People asked me, later when the story leaked like light through drawn curtains, someone saw footprints and told another, and then the rumor gathered like snow. They asked me whether it had been a trap, a test, a threat. I could tell them the things I was permitted to tell, that I had followed the creature into the woods, and that what happened there would terrify anyone who thinks cruelty is always loud and monstrous. I could tell them about the ledger, and the ceremony, and the album. I could not tell them, because I did not yet understand, whether the ledger had saved anyone or condemned them. The moral geometry had no straight lines. 3 months after that first storm, the creature did something I did not expect. It brought me a photograph in a frame it had likely found in a drawer somewhere in someone's house years ago. The photograph was of a woman, hair tucked back, eyes younger than in Linda's wedding picture. She was seated on a bench, hand resting on a closed book. When I took the frame, the creature tapped the glass with 2 knuckles, then pointed to the book on the bench, then to the album in my hands, then finally at me. It was a line drawn in symbols: memory, story, bearing. I began to visit the edge of the woods without the pretense of being lured. I went to the circle sometimes on my own, in daylight, and left small things I thought they'd value: a patch of wool I had knitted into a square, a slice of lemon cake packed in wax paper. I could not tell if it was giving me permission to be near, or if I was trespassing into a liturgy in which humans were not the center. The clearing never looked the same twice. Sometimes it was neat. Sometimes a small mess of leaves lay where the objects had been rearranged while the creatures hunted or slept. Always, though, there was a feeling of presence that both comforted and unnerved me. Seasons moved. The snow melted into a bleak stew of mud and twigs. Spring came with a sting, and the creature's fur thinned in places, revealing pink skin like old paper. They changed in slow increments, like houses peeling paint. Their rituals adjusted to weather. In summer, they left items that smelled of sun and grass. In autumn, things that smelled of rain and old fires. This went on until the ledger that had terrified me became a strange kind of map I could read. There were times I wanted to force the ledger into the hands of authorities. There were nights when a thought took shape in me. Call someone, tell them the album exists, let others see the proof. Each time, the thought died a slow death under the weight of possibilities. What would they do? Close the clearing off? Remove the objects as evidence? Box the creatures under glass and call it science? I thought of factory cages set up with bright lights and men with clipboards, and I decided silence was an act of mercy and a coward's refusal in equal measure. Life, in those months, taught me to keep both hands occupied.
I mended the roof. I tried to learn the rhythm of the creature's tapping. I wrote small notes and left them tucked into the album as messages that might be found and read. Once, in a fit of idiocy, I wrote a short sentence, "We are not so different," and left it between pages. The album accepted the note as if it had been given all along. That quiet mutual acknowledgement mattered. Years, if you measure them by seasons, dissolve in a way I don't wish to chart precisely. People left town, others arrived. Linda and I, for all our shared rooms and mutual softness, never reconciled in the way the movies would demand. Some conversations are not built to be bridges. We exchanged letters one winter, and then a long silence. She came by once and left a cup on the windowsill. The creature tapped the cup, and then tapped me, twice, and then left a photograph of a street I had once driven down with her. Little currents of memory cross and recross until the fabric both strengthens and frays. As for me, I learned a new vocabulary of being watched and watching back. I learned that hospitality can be an instrument and a covenant. I learned that sometimes giving is not a theft but a way of being named in another's ledger. I also learned in that slow ache of example that terror can be a gateway into an odd sort of kinship when mercy is what you have most of. The ledger never gave me an answer about those who had been photographed. Once, in a drunken, foolish hour, I asked it bluntly, "Are they dead?" The response came in a photograph laid on my table the next morning. A picture of a woman walking along a shore in a red coat, her back to the camera, and a small note tucked behind it, a scrap of newspaper with a date circled. The creature's language was not linear. It suggested that absence takes many shapes: death, departure, forgetting, willful leaving. Each one counts as a story to be kept. There was a finality of sorts in the way the creature changed our exchanges over time. It stopped bringing objects of human manufacture and began bringing things that had been crafted from the woods, a bracelet of bark, a tiny carved whistle that, when blown, made a sound like an answering bird. Once it left, at my step, a small ladder woven from saplings. When I asked it, not with words but with a patient knocking on the armrest, about the album, it took my hand and led me to a different stump, where a new book lay. It opened it and slid into my palm a photograph I had never owned, Linda on a street, laughing at something I could not see. The caption, in a hand not mine, read only, "Remember." We came to an arrangement that was, in its own terms, stable. The creature would come, I would welcome it with tea, we would exchange small gifts, and then part with the ritual of tapping twice. It did not come every night. Sometimes months passed, and then on a random dusk when the sky carried the chill of autumn, it would be on my porch, rain beating on its fur. Sometimes it would stay for an hour and leave. Sometimes it would sleep outside for a week. Once, when I awoke to the sound of great breathing on the door, I left it a quilt and found it bent over that same quilt, singing, if that's what the low, thin sounds were, with a cadence that somehow matched the rhythm of my own mother's lullaby. The sound moved through me like an apology and a benediction. I am not a man who believes in tidy moral endings. The ledger did not stop being a ledger. The woods retained their inscrutability. But something in me loosened. Where once I had lived in the desiccated shell of my life, now there were small living things moving through the edges. Neighbors came more often. I mowed the lawn in summer. I lent a ladder to a woman down the road who had a sign on her porch that read, "Pie." I learned that the work of re-entering is filled with small acts that feel like cheap tacks on a map, but in time they hold. There were nights when terror returned with a crispness, a sound in the attic that was not mice,
a silhouette among the trees that wasn't the creature I had come to know. Once, some years later, I went down to the clearing on a whim, afraid of what I might find. The ledger was there, of course, pieces of the world kept like bonsai. And then I found in the album a photograph that made my stomach drop, a single picture of a woman in a wedding dress who looked very much like Linda, taken from the back as she walked down a quiet street. It was the sort of image that asks questions with its silence. When I returned to the cabin, I found the creature on the porch waiting, its eyes a little clouded with something like worry. It tapped twice and then set down a small wooden crate. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a handful of old coins and a faded ribbon. The creature lifted my hand, pressed the coins into it, and tapped twice on its chest. Then it pointed once down the road, toward the town and then to the horizon. The meaning was clear enough now. Go, live, remember us. I did. I began, slowly and not without fear, to become a man willing to be seen. I went to feed the neighbor's cat and stayed to watch the sunset with a woman who sold apples in the market. I mended a fence, and in the doing found the pleasure of work that matters beyond keeping a roof up. The ledger stayed at the edge of my life like a taut string. Sometimes I put food out and found something new on the step. Sometimes nothing at all. It was a pattern of small mercies and continued small anxieties. People still ask me, when they're brave enough, whether I'm afraid. I'm honest. Yes, I'm afraid of what I cannot know, of the ledger's silent pages, of how much of our loneliness we are willing to hand over to others. I'm afraid that someday I might approach the clearing and find the album closed and the ring empty.
But I also know other things. That curiosity can be dangerous and also necessary. That mercy and terror are often neighbors. That the act of following might terrify you, but sometimes it also teaches you the shape of your own hand. The last time I saw the creature, before I put that album on my shelf where the sunlight could touch it, it came to my porch in the late blue of autumn. It set down a small bundle wrapped in a strip of cloth, and then, as if remembering a habit of mine, tapped twice on the doorframe. Inside the bundle was a small photograph of the clearing, emptied of objects in a way that suggested the creatures had moved away, at least for now. On the back, someone, perhaps one of the creatures, perhaps not, had written in a careful, slow script, "We keep you as you kept us." I laughed once, a dry sound that did not much resemble anything like triumph. The creature watched me, and then, without ceremony, it sat and rested its great head on my porch step like an old dog welcoming a friend. I poured 2 mugs of tea and sat on the bottom stair. We drank in silence. The world made its noises around us. A car on the distant road, a dog's bark, the creek behind my property complaining in summer heat. For a while, the only rhythm was the 2 slow taps it gave to its own chest, and my own palm pressing the cup like a human benediction. I followed it into the woods, and what happened next terrified me in ways that were not simple. The terror was not only the unknown, it was the demand for a life to change its terms. It was the ledger of objects, the album, the ceremony of giving. It was the fact that a creature could be so like us that we were made to look monstrous in its mirror. It was the choice to give or not to give, and the realization that giving sometimes means becoming part of another being's story in a way that is both moving and unmoored. And yet, out of that terror, something tender grew. I found in the company of that strange, patient intelligence an odd form of companionship that did not replace human love, but expanded what the word could hold. I found in the exchanges of objects and in the slow ritual of tapping twice a way back to the community I had unmade in my grief. The ledger remained, a map of absences and presences, a terrifying archive that taught me to carry memory differently. If this unsettled you, share it and subscribe for more encounters that feel like they might be true. And tell me, in the comments, what would you have left in the clearing if someone asked you to be remembered?